All right, again, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the September LEA Special Education Points of Contact Monthly Webinar. Today's webinar, we will be talking about the very timely and important issue of child count. So we'll be going through some child count information for you today. Today, I am joined with folks from the SSK-12, and I'll let those folks introduce themselves for today's webinar.
Good morning, this is Christy Weaver-Harris. I'm the Policy Manager in the Division of K-12 Systems and Support. I'm going to be presenting some information on behalf of myself on the policy team and also on behalf of our monitoring and compliance team.
Okay, in today's agenda, we'll be talking about preparing for 2019 child count. We'll be reviewing some policy, monitoring, and compliance updates and discussing the reevaluation process. And we'll finish up with some announcements and reminders. Okay, so preparing for school year 19-20 child count. We want to do just a brief overview of the child count process, where we will also look at comparing enrollment audit and child count. We'll take a look at the 2019 child count timeline and some ways to prepare for a child count in advance. We'll discuss resolving some common errors, the IEP amendment process, and also some of the data systems involved in child count to help support you for child count. So we'll get started. Just go ahead and talking about child count. Most people know that this is a federally mandated activity that we do annually. It's reported, and it serves as the Office of Special Education's enrollment numbers for the District of Columbia. So in accordance with IDEA and all applicable District of Columbia laws and regulations, each LEA is required to certify the accuracy and reliability of its data to the state education agency and the Office of the State Superintendent for Education, OSSE. So accuracy of SEDS data impacts funding for special education. All of the data to be reviewed for child count is provided through SEDS, the Special Education Data System. So if any of the information, the student's special education information is inaccurate, it must be corrected in the source system. And for this, the source system is SEDS. So who are we looking at for child count? This includes students enrolled as of October 7, 2019. The student must have a current IEP and a current eligibility. Any IEP amendments related to child count must be completed by November 14th at 5 p.m. So the student populations that are included in child count, and the chart just kind of shows you a breakdown of who we are looking at for child count, what students and what statuses are included in that child count. So the IEP and eligibility needs to be current. If the student is receiving services under IDEA, yes, they will be included in the child count. So that's what the chart here actually shows you. What you should be very concerned with are students with expired IEPs and expired eligibility. Students that are not receiving services under IDEA and will not be included in child count. So if this information is incorrect, so if any of this information is incorrect in the student's record, you will have an opportunity to update that. So just to clarify, we are talking about students that are enrolled in your student information system as of October 7th. So they have to have an enrollment date as of October 7th. But if any amendments need to be made, if you need to correct the IEP or update the eligibility, those things have to be done by November 14th. Thank you. And that brings us right to the child count timeline. And let's walk through some of that. So today, this really serves as your LEA Special Ed POC webinar training about child count. From October 8th to November 14th, the LEA POC should be assessing and reviewing and resolving all child count anomalies. So that goes into those amendments that need to be made for child count purposes. October 11th, the LEA is going to sign the enrollment audit and anomalies acknowledgement form with the enrollment audit application within. So that's online now in Qlik. You'll do the enrollment audit application, and that's actually the first certification, October 11th. So again, you have up into the 14th to resolve all child count anomalies, and then by the 15th, the LEA will sign data certification within the enrollment audit application. By December 18th, the final enrollment audit and child count acknowledgement form will be signed.
So we received a couple of questions. One of the questions that we got was, what about students who are in the middle of the eligibility process and won't have an IEP finished by October 7th? We ask that you go ahead and finish that student's IEP as long as it's finished by November 14th. Must be finalized in the system by October 14th.
Right. And just to kind of restate this, what we're looking at, the October 7th, as you should remember, is the enrollment date. So your student needs to actually be enrolled at your school as of October 7th to count for child count. In addition to, they need to have an updated eligibility and IEP that should be completed by the 14th.
Something else to clarify is that for the purpose, when you're dealing with data anomalies, if you have just a purely data anomaly that must be resolved using OSCE's OST process, you want to make sure that you submit that by November 1. You want to submit that for OSCE to get the work completed on it by November 14th. So 2 weeks ahead of the final date for your data certification. If that's just a purely data issue, so if the student is being attributed to the wrong LEA, something that OSCE can fix on OSCE's end, you want to submit that OST ticket by November 1. For student-level data anomalies, so something that you need to fix in the student SEDS file, you want to complete that by November 14th so that it can be in the system and count for November 15th when you certify your data.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Some other reminders that we kind of alluded to a little bit, data accuracy. We talked about the LEA needs to review and update data in the respective source system. So if that is SEDS or if the update needs to come in your student information system, the expectation is that you will have done that. Also, issue resolutions. LEAs should submit OST tickets. As Christy was saying, in a timely manner to ensure there's enough time to resolve it before the certification date. So if you're entering those OST tickets by November 1st, prior to, that gives us 2 weeks to resolve those issues on the OSCE end. So let's talk about some ways to prepare for child count in advance. One of those ways is to remove all students from your SEDS roster who no longer attend your LEA. So you can work with your registrar to ensure that those students are properly exited with the appropriate exit code in your student information system.
Also, this is Pauline here. For those students that are persisting on your SEDS roster and you have not have them removed yet, please make sure you're submitting an OST ticket. You're reviewing the Appendix B of the Entry and Exit Guidance, which shows you what documentation OSCE will be looking for to exit those students off the SEDS roster. And this is based on whatever exit code you use for the student. Please be mindful, if you have 10 or more students that need to be exited, it may take longer than the allotted window of 5 days for the OSC ticket, because we have to check every single documentation in the system to assure that the documents match the exit.
So, ensuring the SEDS records are fully transferred for all students enrolled at your LEA. And also in training your case manager to spot common errors on the IEP, which we will look at in just a little bit. Checking the UDE or the Unified Data Errors report daily to take a look at those special ed errors. And also update all IEPs that are set to expire prior to the certification date. The next chart shows you a summary of child count actions, the data type, and the action that is required. So if you have a demographic data error that needs to be resolved, and that includes name, date of birth, race, or ethnicity, they need to be reviewed and then updated in your source system. So in your student information system, whether that is eSchool Plus, PowerSchool, Aspen, or any of the other systems in use in the district, that is where demographic information should be updated. For special education data errors such as disability, IEP dates, educational environment, or dedicated aids, again, that information should be updated in the source system, and that system is SEDS. So if it's accurate, no action is required. But if it is inaccurate, you will need to go through the process of updating that information. So whether that be the disability, and it requires an update to the eligibility, or the IEP date, meaning your IEP is expired and needs to have an annual review to update the date in the system. Your educational environment, as we'll see in just a little bit as we take a look at some other errors for child count, some of the options for educational environment have changed. So making sure that you have selected the appropriate educational environment for the student. And also dedicated aid, just to ensure that the dedicated aid is present in the student's IEP if required. So I'm going to pause for just a moment. We're going to take a couple of questions before we move into some common child count data errors. Okay, so coming back, we want to start talking about reviewing some of these anomalies. Most people already have access in Qlik, which has the unified data errors, and that will show you the special education errors, and the suggested resolution paths are also provided for most of those errors. All LEA special ed POCs should have access to the UDE Qlik application. And we are going to actually just show you a little bit of what's in that. I think most people have seen that UDE application to show you the special education errors. So when searching for students in SEDS with disabilities, by filtering for special ed, you may not get students who have expired IEPs or students whose records have fully transferred. So this is when you are starting the process at your LEA for reviewing those records that need to be updated for the purposes of child count. So when you're doing those searches, if you use the filter special ed, just be aware that you may miss students by doing that. You may miss the students that have expired IEPs, or again, if their records are not fully transferred. If the special education level is incorrect, you want to confirm the service start dates and end dates to make sure that they're correct, and then confirm that the least restrictive environment percentage and checkboxes are appropriately marked. So the educational environment will be pulled from the most recent IEP and SEDS, or if that most recent IEP is an amendment, that's where the information would be pulled. If the educational environment is not accurate, it may be appropriate for you to complete an IEP amendment. You also have the ability, if you are updating the IEP just for the purposes of updating the LRE, you can also use the update IEP. So if you're doing a full review of the IEP, if you're just updating the LRE section, you can use the update IEP, and that is a new tab in SEDS. And I'll show you that in just a minute once we get logged in.
And we're hearing from a couple of folks that we know you can't click directly into those links during the webinar. We're going to definitely send up a follow-up email with links to all of the resources that are mentioned in this PowerPoint.
Okay, so special ed data error, the student has an expired IEP but an active eligibility. We are suggesting that you hold an IEP meeting and update and finalize the student's IEP in SEDS. The next common child count data error that we see a lot of is that the student is active in SEDS but withdrawn in the student information system. So these are instances where the LEA is going to need to ensure that the appropriate exit code was used. You should work with your registrar to determine that. If the appropriate exit code was used, then the LEA should follow the process in SEDS to have the student administratively exited from the roster. And for more information about that, you can look at the appendix in the entry and exit guidance. Just a little bit more on removing students from your SEDS roster. If the LEA needs to take any action to remove a student who's remained on your roster, even in some cases after that student has left the LEA, there are additional steps that you'll need to take to make sure that that student has been properly removed. So let's just walk through just a couple of those situations where you'll need to take some additional steps to make sure the student gets administratively exited.
Yeah. So as Rita was mentioning before, and I mentioned earlier, we developed an Appendix B, which actually gives you step-by-step understanding of what we need in order to exit a student off your SEDS roster administratively. So failure to properly exit a student from the student information system. So if you see a student on your SEDS roster that no longer attends your LEA, please work with the registrar to ensure that the student was exited appropriately. If the student was exited appropriately and the exit code in which was used requires documentation, in the Appendix B, you can find the documentation that OSSI will be looking for. That documentation must be uploaded in the student's records in SEDS. For students who have graduated from your LEA, we are requiring that the LEA have a summary of performance, which is 60 days prior to the student graduating in SEDS. And we also need a completed diploma graduation form or a PWN, either or. That information is also available on the Appendix B, and we want to make sure that those documentation is in SEDS under the student record. An OST ticket will be submitted to exit those students, and we will remove those students from the SEDS roster. Students who have aged out of special education but the age-out process has not been completed, for those students who have aged out of your LEA, we're requiring an age-out form or a PWN, but mostly an age-out form for those students to remove those students off the SEDS roster. And again, all that information is documented in the Appendix B of the entry and exit guidance. student has transferred to a new LEA, but the records transfer process has not been completed, you can see Appendix C for the special education records transfer process, and that will tell you the timeline. It usually takes 24 to 48 hours if a student is transferred to another LEA within the district.
Great, thank you so much, Pauline. All right, back to our the common child count errors that we were reviewing. The next area we're talking about are students that turned age 6 and no educational environment is designated on the IEP or is no longer appropriate for the child's age. OSSI is asking, OSSI accounts for those students that are turning age 6 prior to the certification date. Those students are actually pulled from the errors based on that date, their date of birth. So those students will be excluded. You don't need to worry about that particular population of students. Next, specialized instruction and or missing services on the finalized IEP. So you need to review the current finalized IEP and confirm that those hours are accurately reflected. If any corrections need to be made, you'll need to do an IEP amendment and finalize that amendment prior to the due date. And that will update the student's eligibility and or the service hours. Next, the student turned age 8 and is still under the category of developmental delay. The resolution for that is if the student has reached age 8, the LEA should conduct a reevaluation to determine the appropriate disability category and finalize the IEP. If the student's date of birth is inaccurate, please work with the registrar to update that information in the LEA SIS. Finally, the educational environment is not appropriate based on the student's age. Now, in this area, folks should have noticed some change and update in SEDS. We are suggesting that the LEA review the student's date of birth to ensure the age is accurate. And then if the age displayed in the enrollment audit and child count data is accurate, then the LEA will need to select an appropriate educational environment in SEDS and complete the finalized IEP.
All right, so this is just a reminder that educational environment and LRE are different ideas, right? The LRE is where the student is educated. That's an IEP team level decision. The educational environment, oh, and also special education level is different. So the LRE is described, is the environment in which the student is receiving their education, but that is the degree to which the student is being educated with their non-disabled peers. The educational environment, and thanks for working with us, we're having some technical issues. The educational environment is specifically for the purposes of federal reporting. And we have updated SEDS in accordance with what the federal reporting requirements are for educational environment, which is why you see a change in the percentages. We know that the percentages were basically flipped on their heads, where before it used to be the student is educated 0 to 20% outside of the education, or 0 to 20% outside of the general education environment. It's now reads 80 to 100% inside the general education environment. Just make sure that those descriptions are accurate for your students. So special education level is something that you hear talked about a lot in DC, but that is a UPSFF-based funding label that is described in the DC code. So I just want to clarify for everybody that LRE is the IDEA requirement, educational environment is for the purposes of federal reporting, and then special education level is just a local funding mechanism.
Thanks, Christy. Now, let's talk briefly about IEP amendments for child count purposes, and three of the most common amendments that we see for child count purposes. Educational environment. So SEDS does not automatically change that LRE radio selection. When these services are updated on the IEP, this must be done manually in SEDS before you finalize the IEP or when you're doing an IEP amendment. Now, you do have the ability to make changes. If the only change that you need to make here is in this section, then I will show you in the Update IEP how you can do that. The setting, frequency, or length of the services, and also dedicated aid. So these are the three most common amendments that we see for child count purposes. So if you are holding amendments for child count purposes, you can either have a meeting, conduct the IEP meeting without having the team meeting when it's documented between the parent and the LEA. Or you can convene a full IEP team meeting to discuss the proposed amendment. Next, we want to look at using the Unified Data Errors, the UDE Qlik application for child count. All LEA POCs at this point should have access to at least these three Qlik applications. The first is that Related Services Management Report, the Unified Data Errors, and also the Early Access to Students with Disabilities. So those are the main Qlik applications that you should have access to. If you do not have access to these Qlik applications, please contact your DAR liaison for assistance, and also ensure that you are listed as the SPED POC in eSchool Plus. Okay, so once you get access in Qlik, you'll be able to go to the Unified Data Errors, and then you'll click on the Special Education Data Errors. Okay, so I just want to display for folks that have not seen the Unified Data Errors Qlik application that it will show you the Special Education Data Errors. Once you've identified an error, and again, we are in a training site, once you see the student and the USI, it will actually show you the different error and the resolution. So if I select this first student here, it'll show me how many unique students I have with this particular error. You can select the error category. So educational environment, attending a correctional facility, I just selected that particular error. It's showing me how many students I have with that error. It also shows you the resolution. So insufficient number of service hours, it shows you the resolution or the suggested resolution on the right-hand side. If you do not have access to the Unified Data Errors Qlik application, please reach out to your DAR liaison. Okay, some other child count preparation for LEA POCs is just to be sure that your students that are listed in the application were enrolled as of October 7th. You want to work with your LEA data manager and enrollment staff to make sure that the student information in your SIS is also accurate. And a good practice is to review those unified data errors and Qlik on a daily basis. That information can change as you are updating IEPs in the system. Again, it's pulling from the most recent finalized IEP. So you want to ensure all IEPs are accurate and up to date for educational environment, services, dedicated aid, and disability category. And then you'll amend IEPs as necessary to rectify any errors or anomalies. If questions arise, remember to submit your issues and questions in the OSCE OST. And then you will have reviewed and resolved all anomalies no later than November 15th to be considered timely. We're going to pause for just a moment to take any questions that you have from the child count training portion of today's presentation. So go ahead and type in your questions, and we're going to pause for just a minute so that we can address some of those. All right, so we have received a ton of questions about LRE and information around that. What we're going to do, because we have so many questions and a limited amount of time, we're going to put all those questions and the responses together in a one-pager and send that out to you guys as a follow-up to this webinar. So you will receive answers to those LRE questions and some of the other things that you guys are asking in the chat box.
So we'll send out that guidance directly to everyone that's registered for this webinar. We'll also post it on our website with our enrollment audit information. And we'll make sure that we draw parallels between the prior LRE percentages and the current LRE percentages, and what you should do in the event that you see a student that, for example, is in the general education environment for 79.5% of the time, and whether that student should be included in like the 40 to 79% or the 80 to 100%. That is a very frequent question that we get, and we want to make sure that we're providing consistent and solid response on that. So we'll try and turn that around as soon as possible, because we know that you guys are dealing with this right now. So we'll make sure that there's a couple of questions in here that have been frequent flyers. We want to make sure that's communicated consistently to all LEAs, not just the folks on this webinar.
Great.
Oh, and one clarification that people have been asking about how to use the Update IEP tab. The only thing that you can change in the Update IEP tab is the student's educational environment. If there is an educational environment error on the student's IEP, you can go into the Update IEP tab and change only that section of the IEP, of the student information in the SEDS file, I should say. That no longer prints on the IEP because it's not an accurate depiction of the student's LRE. Again, those percentages and that educational environment information, especially as it relates to things like correctional facility, if the student is placed in a correctional facility. The correctional facility is not the student's least restrictive environment, right? The IEP team didn't say that the best place for that student to access an education is in a correctional facility. But for the purposes of federal reporting, we have to gather that information from you within SEDS, and that is why it is not printing on the IEP, because it is not an accurate depiction of the best educational environment for the student. So, to update educational environment, you can go in through the Update IEP tab, and that is to resolve a long-standing issue that we know LEAs were having to deal with updating the educational environment for the purposes of child count. And previously, when it wasn't printed on the IEP, you were having a tough time explaining that to parents, right? Like, hey, we need to have an IEP team meeting to amend this thing that you didn't even know existed. So initially, we put it on the IEP. We now recognize that that wasn't an accurate depiction of the student's educational environment or the student's LRE. So we pulled it from the IEP and made it possible for you to update it on the Update IEP tab. And we'll also send out a little, within the guidance that we are referring to, we'll clarify that in the guidance also. All right. So now we're going to talk about something completely different. Just a reminder that you should have access to SEDS, to all of these. Did you go through all these? Yeah. To the OSCE support tool, to TOTE. You may need access to SLED, but somebody at your LEA will have access to SLED. So let's somewhat quickly try and get through the reevaluation process. So the district as a whole is currently under specific conditions from the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programming. For secondary transition and reevaluation, this is why you hear from us so frequently on these two compliance indicators. For both secondary transition and reevaluation, the targets are 100% and the district is at less than 100%. We have made significant gains in the last couple of years. For example, well, in many, many years. For example, in, I think it was 2003 or 2006, we were at 3% compliance on secondary transition. And we are now in the 70s. For reevaluation, it's been the same thing. We've made significant gains over the last couple of years, and that is due to the hard work at the LEA level and at the school level, and we recognize that. However, for October 1, 2018 through March 30th, 2019, our compliance rate as a district was 87.1%, and with that target at 100%, we are still under specific conditions, and we still have some work left to do. We understand that there's a lot of barriers that LEAs face around reevaluation, right? It can be tough to get related service providers to do their assessments. It can be tough to get parents to respond to requests for parental consent. It can be tough to get everybody in the school building scheduled for a meeting at the same time. Like, we recognize that, and OSSI is working to develop additional guidance and technical assistance to help your LEA overcome those challenges. We're also looking at how we can assist on the data side to make sure that the students that you are seeing as untimely for reevaluation are actually your students. For example, a student that is enrolled in your LEA leaves the district for a couple of months or a year, and while they're outside of the district, their reevaluation timeline expires. So then when they re-enroll, what happens? You get a kid on your SEDS roster that immediately pops up with a red stop sign. And I know you love the red stop sign. Like, I know that's the best part of your day. So we're taking a look at how we can assist LEAs and making sure that the students that you really have to do a reevaluation for are the ones that you're doing the reevaluation for, and that OSSI's data protocols are accurately reflecting how those students should be counted. So your LEA was given your reevaluation timeliness rate for FFY 17 in your FFY 17 determination that was issued in early September. And also just a flag, I know OSSI in general has started abbreviating things in a way that you people have never heard it from us before, but internally we generally abbreviate secondary transition as STR and reevaluation as REV. We also sometimes tend to abbreviate initial evaluation as IEV. So if you see those abbreviations in our presentations or in our documents, that's where it's coming from. And you can also track your upcoming reevaluations that are due in your LEA P&P. That can be found in SLED under the Enterprise Reporting System. So we encourage LEAs to use that report to help you know when students' reevaluation is coming due. You can also tell based on when you log into SEDS, those compliance indicators, again, your favorite thing, the red stop sign. But before it's a red stop sign, it's a yellow marker, right, that says T for timeliness. Make sure that you're paying attention to those things because we do try to flag for you softly on those sides that a student's reevaluation is coming due. Again, the compliance indicators in SEDS are not actual determinations of compliance. Those are just indicators to guide and assist you in making sure that you're carrying out your obligations. OSSI does not rely on them for the purposes of compliance. We actually pull the hard back-end data and review that for the purposes of compliance. So just to do a brief overview of what is actually required in a reevaluation is any evaluation that is conducted after the initial evaluation. And it's the process through which the IEP team takes a look at student data to determine if the child continues to be a child with a disability, to determine the student's present levels of achievement and their developmental needs, and any necessary additions or modifications to the student's IEP. So that if you are conducting additional assessments or taking an additional look at the existing data for the student to determine their continued eligibility, their present levels, or any necessary additions or modifications. So it's not the annual IEP meeting where you take a look at that student data and decide what they need to, like what you need to change for the coming year. This is an actual reevaluation of the student as a whole. It must occur at least once every 3 years, or before determining that the student is no longer a student with a disability. So if you think that the student is ready to exit the system, you can't just say, okay, you're exited. You need to make sure that you're conducting a reevaluation. It can occur more frequently than every 3 years if appropriate, like if the IEP team agrees, or if the LEA believes that a reevaluation is necessary, or if the parent requests one. We know that in the district, parents tend to ask for them on a more frequent basis, but a reevaluation of a student does not need to occur more than once a year. So something that's important to remember about reevaluation is that there are no required assessments to conduct a reevaluation. The IEP team can take a look at the data that is existing and available to it as part of the AED or analysis of existing data and agree together to determine eligibility without conducting additional assessments. So like a psycho ed is not required. A full ed assessment is not required. Individual assessments from related service providers, formal assessments, are not required, at least at the state level. Your LEA may have other processes or procedures that you have established to make sure that you are taking a look at appropriate data as part of a reevaluation. I encourage you to follow those processes and procedures, but at the LEA level, I also encourage you to consider how you can leverage the existing data that you already have so that you can make these determinations in a more timely manner, and so that you're not ordering additional assessments or frustrating yourselves having to order additional assessments with external evaluators. So some best practices for reevaluation, we encourage you to plan ahead and to backdate things so that you know that you're sending your parent notice and your parent request for consent early enough, that you're coordinating with your related service providers, and you're planning enough time to complete your assessment. We know a lot of schools and a lot of LEAs rely on school-wide calendars that you develop at the beginning of the year to track those activities. We encourage you to continue that excellent practice. We also encourage you to rely on the LEA P&P so that you have awareness of when things are due and when things are coming up due. We encourage you to discuss reevaluation with the parent during the IEP annual review that occurs in the year prior to when the reevaluation is due. So flag to the parent early, hey, we're going to need your consent for this. Like, your child is due for a reevaluation. This is what that may look like. We're going to make a determination at the time about whether we need to order additional assessments, but we definitely need your responsiveness there. If a parent fails to respond or refuses to respond to provide, if the parent fails to respond or refuses to provide consent for the reevaluation, the LEA is not obligated to move forward with the reevaluation. You may move forward with the reevaluation if you exercise due process in that case, but you are not required to under IDEA. And again, we encourage you to leverage your existing student data, such as classroom observations, teacher information, parent information, assessments that you are performing as part of your regular school cycle, and progress monitoring data. So again, you don't have to order additional assessments if you don't think that it's necessary. All right, Rita's going to show you the reevaluation process in SEDS fairly quickly because we recognize we're running out of time. So hold on for just a second while we bring up that screen.
All right, so I brought up a test student just for the purposes of showing you a few things in the eligibility process for reevaluation. So I'm going to go to the Analyze Existing Data section. That's where you will be doing the bulk of your work. A couple of things I want to point out is that you do have the ability to add new areas to consider during reevaluation, or you can also remove some areas if needed, and I'll show you that in just a second. So as Christy mentioned, any new area that you think needs to be included in that reevaluation, you can just check those areas at the top in the areas to consider, and as you scroll down, you will have the detail boxes to be able to go in and give specific details about any of those areas that you have added in the eligibility process. Next thing I want to show in the additional assessments. Now we know that the additional assessment may not be needed, but if you are adding new areas to consider, you may need to order an assessment in one of those new areas. So in your additional assessments area, It will allow you to request additional assessments for any of those new areas in which you have added in the eligibility. And finally, in the eligibility determination section, I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom. If you are doing a reevaluation, and let's say that all of these areas were checked from the previous evaluation of the student, you can deselect the areas at this point during the reevaluation that you are expecting to write goals on when you get over to the IEP process. So whatever areas are checked here when you finalize this, those will be the areas that populate in your goals section in the IEP process. So if you don't want them there, if they need to be removed since the last eligibility, you can uncheck them and save that information, okay? And then that will be your final areas that you're using before you finalize the eligibility. Another thing I'm going to jump over to just really quickly is that Update IEP tab. Some folks were asking, they hadn't seen what that looks like. Let me show you that quickly. I'm going to click on that Update IEP tab. It will be the tab, I'm sorry, let me switch students again. You do need to have a current IEP in order to use the Update IEP tab. Okay, and then I can go to the Update IEP tab. Now, what you will see here is you will see the ability to change the educational environment. The date will default to whatever date you are logged into the system, and this will allow you to change that educational environment selection to be in alignment with the student's true description of that educational environment. Once you select that and you click Update the Database, you will now see the Update IEP on that student's record. That's how you can verify that it has been completed, and you can actually click on the Details tab, and it'll show you what was changed. That we identified a LRE placement category, number 3, inside regular class, less than 40% of the day. So it'll show you the update that was made on that Update IEP tab. As we mentioned earlier, we're going to compile these frequently asked questions about LRE and some of the other questions that you all put into your chat box for today's webinar presentation. If you have any other questions, just go ahead and type them in your chat window. We're going to hang on the line for just a minute or two. All right, so let's pause for just a minute, and you can answer any questions that you may have for the eligibility process reevaluation or in that Update IEP tab. I will pause and let you go ahead and answer some questions.
All right, we are running low on time, so I'm going to go through some pretty quick updates for you guys. Just a flag that later today, OSCE's IDA Monitoring and Compliance team is going to host a webinar on how to use the DC CAP system, and they're going to go over some changes that are in DC CAP. That's the online system that LEAs use to correct special education noncompliance. And this information was provided to you during the Start of School Summit also, but we were going to be making some changes to DC CAP. We strongly encourage you to participate in that webinar. There is a link to registration that we know that you cannot access, but we will include that in the follow-up email that we'll send out right after this. Hold on 1 second, we're having a little bit of technical issues. Okay, sorry, we had to switch presenters, the laptop died. Okay, some updates from our assessment team. MSAA and DC Science Alt, are our alternative assessments that are administered to eligible students on an annual basis. And to be eligible, the student must have a significant cognitive disability, be learning content that is linked to Common Core state standards and next generation science standards, and that student must require extensive, direct, individualized instruction and substantial support to access the grade-appropriate curriculum. So here is the overview of the timeline for ALT assessment eligibility. LEAs are expected to complete ALT assessment eligibility determinations, new applications and renewals between September 9th and October 18th. By November 15th, OSSE will be reviewing those applications and the documentation in SEDS. In the meantime, we will send to LEAs that are exceeding the 1% cap, we will send a memo and justification form to those LEAs. On November 8th, LEAs must submit back to OSSE the exceeding 1% cap justification form. On November 18th, OSSE will send eligibility determinations to LEAs in SEDS, so that we will be responsive to your new applications and renewal applications for students to participate in the ALT assessment. You will hear back from us about that on November 18th. Between November 18th and January 10th, LEAs may appeal those determinations, and then a final eligibility determination will be made by January 15th of 2020. And the MSAA testing window is still being determined. You'll get more information on that later. So ALT assessment eligibility applicants for the current school year should be new third grade students, or students who are newly enrolled in the district, or students who have been newly identified as a student with a disability in grades 3 through 8 or in grade 11. Students who were previously determined eligible for MSAA in the previous school year will automatically be, their eligibility for MSAA will automatically continue for this school year. Just a reminder that you can access our training and resources, getting started with SEDS, navigating the initial eligibility process, which we're actually going to be updating in the next month or so, and then the SEDS basic user guide are all available on OSSE's website. And as always, please register for the LEA Look Forward. OSSE communicates a ton of information to LEAs, not just related to special education, but related to all things OSSE through our LEA Look Forward. If you need more information on how to access that, please send a request directly to osse.communications@dc.gov. So our next webinar is scheduled for Wednesday, October 16th, 2019. Encourage your friends to register. In the meantime, or sometime in October, we will likely be sending out a survey to LEA SE POCs to get your feedback on what sort of information you want to hear covered in these webinars. So be on the lookout for that. We'll email that directly to LEA SE POCs and probably LEA heads of school.
Okay, we have been answering many of your questions online. As we previously stated, we will be sending out a comprehensive FAQ with the questions from today's webinar to share with everyone that's registered for today's webinar presentation. Again, our next webinar will be on Wednesday, October 16th. Please ensure that you know where to access the recorded webinars on the OSSE website. Again, thank you for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you in the next webinar. Have a great afternoon.